Before the vast wilderness of northern Michigan was settled by the white man, it belonged to the great Indian bands of the Ottawa and the Chippewa. The country south of the Straits of Mackinac belonged to the Ottawas, and the country to the north of the Straits was that of the Chippewas. As legend has it, an Ottawa was in dispute over a fishing net and murdered a Chippewa. Normally peaceful, the Chippewas were outraged and threatened war. To keep the peace, the Ottawas ceded the country that extended along the east shore of Lake Michigan. Within a generation, Ottawa villages also consisted of many Chippewa, and the two intermarried. Though the Chippewas were prone to keep their own customs, the Ottawa showed great interest in the education they had witnessed by the French missionaries. This is the story of one such tribe, and the Presbyterian missionary who, through friendship and a mission school, built a community and much more. In response to the Treaty of 1836, Reverend Peter Doherty, with the blessing of the Indian chief Aghosatown, settled near the tip of the peninsula that separates the east and west arms of Grand Traverse Bay. In 1839, this Indian mission, led by Reverend Doherty, became the first settlement in the Grand Traverse region.
In the beginning, in the year 1836, that treaty brought missionaries, teachers, and farmers to come and work with the Indians. But it also had secured for the Indians on the land they were at least 5 years residency. And that had long since passed. And so it was a very difficult time for the Indians. Some left and went north, but many were left there at Old Mission, among them the chief and all of his family members and many others. And so under the state Constitution of 1850, they gave citizenship to all Indians who gave up allegiance to tribes. And so it was at that time that they made land available for sale. They made it here across the bay, which is only about half a dozen miles across from Old Mission to this Omena point. And it was then that Chief Aghosatown brought his across. They built their little homes and stayed down at Aghosatown. And I have never heard it said before, but I did find it in the records of the Presbyterian Board of Foreign Missions that they petitioned the board to send their friend to be with them again. And so the board bought land here, a lot of land, more than 500 acres. He came in April of 1852 with the plan first of building the school, which was here, and he had done that at Old Mission. First the school, which is what the Indians wanted, and then later he would build the church, and he did the same thing at Old Mission. The previous winter was a very bitter one, and ice on the bay was 3 feet thick, and so much of the lumber used to build the school building here was carried across on the ice. And it was built during the period 52 through 53. They opened the school in the fall of 53. It was a large school. It was a boarding school, which he had planned, and I'm sure his whole idea was that he had to keep these children together, because the migratory lifestyle that the Indians had, it made it very difficult to do that. And it was a school, 25 girls, 25 boys, and teachers came from the east to teach And among them, my own great-grandmother, Mary McConnell, came from Pennsylvania. And it was here that they not only had a manual training school, which I'm sure Mr. Doherty felt would help the Indians carry through into the lifestyle that they were going to have to lead in a very short time. It would help them. And so when people look back and talk about it, and they talk about the discipline and the very rigid day that they had, and it seems to me now to have been a very long and a very rough day for the Indian children, and probably more so for the teachers. But there was a bell in the morning. It rang at 5 for everybody to be up. And by 6, they were having devotions and then a very substantial breakfast. And for those who remember the pioneers here, breakfast was a really big meal. And then, after that, they worked. At the boys, I suppose, at the farm work, and the girls were taught cooking and sewing, knitting, household things. And they had not only the manual arts things, but they did have academics too. Everybody was taught writing in English and many other subjects. This was a year-round school. And they had the month of April, and all the children joined their families, and they went from one side of Omena on the hill to the hill on the other side for that 1 month. And they set up temporary wigwams, and this is where they did all of the syrup. And they did a lot of things. They had fun times during that period, I know. And they made all of those sap containers out of birch bark. And they had huge wood containers where whole trunks of trees gouged out where they poured in so they could keep filling them from the buckets. But there were even children born at the camp during the 1 month they were away from the school in Aghosatown.
In 1858, the church that stands today was built. It was here the Agosa Indians and the white teachers and settlers formed an incredible bond that was a true community in every sense.
Those who grew up in this church, hearing 2 languages spoken, seeing the whites and the Indians worshiping, working together, that they must surely have been a step ahead in understanding the brotherhood of man. That's the way I feel about it, because I never thought about it at the time. We heard the language and we saw them all together. I have been asked, one woman a long time ago said she remembered when the Indians were all here, but they all sat on one side. So I guess she thought it was a segregated church. Actually, the Indians were here because this is where their teacher was, an Indian. And Mr. Aghosatown always stood on this side and taught his Indian class. They celebrated every holiday. And when people think, and I would probably talk about the rigid schedule they had up there, but they also had marvelous times together. The missionary and the teachers gave them a wonderful time every holiday. They celebrated Halloween, they celebrated Christmas and Thanksgiving, they celebrated May Day, and on New Year's Eve, they had a watch party and ended with a big dinner at midnight. I think everybody who looks back, at least people my age, and remembers Christmases in this place, it's just a joyous memory, one that lasted all through the year at that time, but has lasted a lifetime today. The preparation, I'm sure, was going on long before, although children didn't realize it. And many people were making handmade gifts knitting, sewing, so that every child would have Christmas presents under the tree. But in this place, they came after the white settlers were here from around the countryside, from all the farms. It was a big community gathering. And in the earliest years, they came by sleigh, cutter, and the horses were hitched down below the hill. They had a hitching post. And later, of course, after people had cars, but in the cold weather, they came bundled up against the cold and with fur lap robes all wrapped around them. And after the service and singing in this church, children just listened for the first sound of sleigh bells. It sounded far, far away. And the excitement is something that I could never describe. I've never felt that excited about a Christmas or Santa Claus since. But we would hear the sleigh bells start far in the distance, and there was such excitement. And then they came nearer and nearer, and suddenly they were coming up the hill and loud, and the door flew open, and there was this giant Santa Claus. And out of his pack, he handed out, boxes of nuts and candies and fruits to every person who was in this packed church at the time. It was really a wonderful celebration. So many of the Indians never became as fluent in English as the Aghosas. The Aghosas became very fluent, and David, the chief's son, was here first as interpreter. He was called a church interpreter for them. And then after he could no longer do it, Jacob took over from the time he was a young man. He was a man who gave such service wherever he was needed, and a much-loved man for a whole community, Indians and whites.
By 1866, the Presbyterian Board of Foreign Mission was no longer able to support the school, so it had to close. Reverend Doherty left in the fall of 1871, and many of his flock fell on hard times.
Behind this headstone, I think, lies probably the most poignant story of any that I know in this cemetery. It tells something about the real hardship that some of the whites in those years went through. It's a grave of a little boy, Frank Morgan. His mother, Ann Morgan, taught at the mission school, and her two boys were up there with her when the husband, Jesse, father of the boys, went off to the Civil War. And she was left teaching and caring for them. And the older boy came down with one of the fevers of that day. I believe it was scarlet fever. No doctor was here. And the little boy died in the middle of February. In the coldest of the weather, she had to bring him down and bury him here by this church. That seemed like enough. But in only a few weeks, her husband too died in the Civil War. And the Civil War itself cut off all funding for the teachers at the mission. And so she not only lost her little boy and her husband, but she lost her job as well. And she applied for the only job that was available, and it was a teacher's job out at the Indian school.